Welcome to the discussion video on the module on construction contracts. So we will be guided by the PFRS 15 revenue from contracts with customers as we go along with this module for construction contracts. The learning objectives are apply PFRS 15, which is the revenue from contracts with customers, to account for revenues from and costs of construction contracts. Account for onerous construction contracts. Ibig sabihin ng onerous, these are burdensome or excessive construction contracts. Account for changes in the transaction price of a construction contract. And account for uncertainty in the collectability of contract revenue. So before we proceed with the formal accounting for construction contracts, we have to identify the principles related to the standards ng construction contract. So an entity applies this PFRS 15, revenue from contracts with customers, to account for revenues from contracts with customers. PFRS 15 supersedes PAS 11, which is the construction contracts. So there is a clear definition of a revenue, is a contract and a customer here, so it is for your reading. So what are the core principles related to the PFRS 15? So we have identified PFRS 15 as revenue from contracts with customers. So there are when you refer to the standards, there are related discussions related to what construction contracts are, the related accounting procedures to constructions, anong klaseng constructions ang i-classify natin under PFRS 15. So these are already summarized here. So an entity recognizes revenue to depict the transfer of promised goods or services to customers in an amount that reflects the consideration to which the entity expects to be entitled in exchange for those goods or services. So let us look at the summary of the steps on the recognition of revenues under PFRS 15. Step 1 is to identify the contract with the customer. The contract is with the customer, and among others, the collectibility of the consideration is probable. So ibig sabihin, when we say probable, this is highly possible. So you have to identify the contract if it relates to a customer and the collection is probable. Step 2, we identify the performance obligation in the contract. Each promise to deliver a distinct good or service in the contract is treated as a separate performance obligation. So a promised good or service is distinct, or it can be classified as a distinct if the customer can benefit from the good or service either on its own or together with other resources that are readily available to the customer, and the promise to transfer the good or service is separately identifiable from other promises in the contract. So later, meron tayong mas deeper discussion related to these steps, kasi ito yung kumbaga pine-present muna sa iyo yung overall steps in the revenue recognition, and then iisa-isahin natin lahat ng under doon later. Step 3, we determine the transaction price. Step 4, we allocate the transaction price to the performance obligation. And step 5, we recognize revenue when or as a performance obligation is satisfied. So dito nangyayari yung classification between a performance obligation if it is over time, if it is within a period of time, at a point in time. So, yan yung dalawang classification. Sa transaction price naman, tinitingnan natin yung contract price noong construction contract at yung mga related costs doon. Kasi pwede na meron siyang indicated price, tapos may additional or mga variable fees, pwedeng may fixed fees na included doon sa transaction price. So yun ang i-allocate mo ngayon doon sa performance obligation na na-completed as of a date. So kailangan ma-identify mo whether it is over the period ba itong construction, or at a certain period dapat nagre-recognize ka na ng revenue. Okay, so now let us define a construction contract. Having learned yung definition ng revenue as the income, contract as the agreement between the parties, and the customer being a party in a construction contract, di ba? So, a construction contract is a contract specifically negotiated for the construction of an asset or a combination of assets that are closely interrelated or independent in terms of their design, technology, and function, or their ultimate purpose or use. So, primarily, it is a contract for the construction of an asset. Construction of an asset. So, construction contracts, in-specify dito na these also includes A, the contracts for the rendering of services that are directly related to the construction of an asset. Example, pwede kasing hindi siya mismo yung construction ng asset pero directly related doon. Example, those for the services of project managers and architects. Diba? These are also these are activities related to the construction of a contract. Therefore, this is included in the construction contract, yung cost related to that, yung revenue related to that. Next, contracts for the destruction. So, ang sabi kanina, it is the construction of an asset. So, pwede rin na included yung destruction of an asset because yung pag-destruct ng asset or pagsira ng asset na yon is essential to restore an asset or to construct another asset. Diba? Ganun siya. And the restoration of the environment following the demolition of the assets is also included in the construction contract per se. So, generally daw, these construction contracts are long-term. The date at which the contract is entered into and the date the contract is completed normally fall on different financial reporting periods. So, normally, yung construction contracts na yan ay 2 or more accounting periods. So, the issue now is, paano mo i-account yung mga revenue na earn mo at yung mga cost na nai-incur mo, two accounting periods ang affected. So, ito yung issue kung bakit mayroong separate PFRS 15 revenue from contracts na na-supersede yung PAS 11. Kasi, this will serve as a guide para na maintindihan natin kung paano natin i-account yung mga revenues and costs while hindi pa natatapos yung buong construction project. So, eto na. Simulan natin yung steps related to PFRS 15. 1, we identify the contract with the customer. So, kailangan ma-identify natin yung contract based on this criteria. So, a contract with the customer is accounted for only when all, so dapat lahat ng criteria ay na-met. 1, the contracting parties have approved the contract. So, yung contractor and then yung contractee, they have agreed to a contract and are committed to perform the obligations. Second, the entity can identify each party's rights regarding the goods or services to be transferred. Okay? The entity can identify the payment terms, paano ang bayaran doon sa contract na yan. D, the contract has commercial substance, that is the lease timing or amount of the entity's future cash flows is expected to change as a result of the contract. So kung meron siyang commercial substance, ibig sabihin the benefit will be greater than the cost related to the construction. The consideration in the contract is probable of collection. When assessing collectibility, the entity considers only the customer's ability and intention to pay the consideration on that date. So, dapat may probability of collection kasi kung wala, you cannot establish yung construction contract na yan. Kasi kung walang probability of collection, therefore, there is a possibility to terminate the contract at the midterm, di ba? No revenue is recognized on a contract that does not meet the criteria above. Any consideration received from such contract is recognized as a liability. So, ang sinasabi lang dito ay, kung merong isang criteria dyan, for example, the probability of collection, hindi ka pwedeng mag-recognize ng revenue kasi one of the criteria is not met. So, kung it will push through, the contract will recognize yung mga consideration na natatanggap as a liability. Kung merong isa dyan ay hindi na met, di ba? Okay. And recognize as revenue only when either of the following has occurred. The entity has no remaining obligation to transfer goods or services to the customer, and all or substantially all of the consideration has been received and is not refundable, and the contract has been terminated and the consideration received is non-refundable. So, yan lang yung cases natin. Yung magre-recognize ka ng revenue na dati ay liability when this A and B happens. Itong dalawang ito. Okay, what happens kapag meron namang combination of contracts? So each contract is accounted for, sabi dyan, ay separately. However, two or more contracts entered into or at or near the same time with the same customer or related parties are combined and accounted for as a single contract if the contracts are negotiated as a package and the amount of consideration to be paid in the contract depends on the price of or performance of the other contract, and some or all of the goods or services promised in the contracts are a single performance obligation. So negotiating multiple contracts at the same time is not sufficient evidence to demonstrate that the contracts requires for a single arrangement. So, the basic assumption for combined contracts is that the contract is accounted for separately. Pero ito yung exceptions niya. Yung A, B, and C, this will guide you as you go along with some of your illustrations. Let's look at step 2. We identify the performance obligations in the contract. Each promise to transfer the following each promise to transfer the following is a performance obligation that is accounted for separately. One, a distinct good or service or a distinct bundle of goods or services and a series of distinct goods or services that are substantially the same and have the same pattern of transfer to the customer. So anong sinasabi dito? I-account mo daw yung bawat transaction separately if distinct yung good or services per transaction at yung there is a series of distinct goods substantially the same bago siya i-transfer sa customer. So let us dig deeper kung anong ibig sabihin nito. Dito muna tayo sa item A, yung distinct. Paano ba natin masasabi na ang isang good or service is distinct? One, if the cost actually ito yung nandito sa tabulation sa summary natin, this is just a reiteration or this is a more detailed discussion related to this. So when we say distinct, a customer can benefit from the good or service either on its own or together with other resources that are readily available to the customer. So ibig sabihin, dun lang mismo sa transaction na yun pwedeng merong benefit na ma-earn. And the promise to transfer the good or service is separately identifiable from other promises in the contract. So, pwede mo siyang ma-separate, pwede mo siyang maiwalay on the contract. So, kapag ganun, the promised good or service is considered as distinct. Okay? So, kailangan, since this is end, ang sabi dyan, these A and B dapat yan ay present parehas bago mo sabihin distinct. Hindi pwedeng the customer can benefit pero hindi siya separately identifiable from other promises in the contract. Kapag ganun, hindi siya considered as distinct kasi end ang sinasabi natin dyan. Okay? Ang dito naman sa you account for the transaction, the performance obligation as separate when it is distinct or when it is a series of distinct goods. So, pwedeng isa lang dyan. Pero dito sa distinct na sinasabi, bago mo siya maklasify as a distinct, it should be the customer can benefit from the good and it is separately identifiable. Sir, paano natin masasabi that the customer can benefit and it is separately identifiable? So, ito po yung susunod na discussion. Let us read more. A customer can benefit from a good or service if the good or service could be used, consumed, sold, or for an amount that is greater than the scrap value. So, ang sinasabi lang dito is the benefit is greater than the cost related to the transaction. Okay? When we say separately identifiable, ito na, kailangan matandaan mo itong 1, 2, and 3 items kasi medyo tricky ito when it is incorporated in a problem. So, medyo nakakalito kasi when dito, ano siya, text siya. Pero kapag in-include na siya sa isang illustration, meron na siyang numerical figures na baka hindi mo na maalala kung ano yung mga text or yung provisions related to that. So sabi, it is separately identifiable if it is not an input to combined output specified by the customer. later, iintindihan natin kung ano yung input, not an input o combined output. It does not significantly modify another good or service promised in the contract, and it is not highly interrelated with other goods or services promised in the contract. For example itong item 3, the customer's decision of not purchasing a good does not affect the other promised goods in the contract. So it is not interrelated. So sasabihin mo lang siya na ay separately identifiable if it is not an input to a combined output, if it is not significantly modified, and it is not highly interrelated. So tandaan mo na lang yung not an input to a combined output, it is not significantly modified, and it is not highly interrelated. So what happens when the transaction is not separately identifiable? Eh di ba sabi kanina kapag merong customer benefit pero hindi siya separately identifiable, hindi mo siya pwedeng tawagin as distinct. Ang sabi doon, it is treated as a single performance obligation. Yung buong transaction is a single performance obligation and it's not accounted separately. Okay? Ano naman yung case ng series of distinct goods or services? A series of distinct goods or services that are substantially the same and have the same pattern of transfer to the customer accounted for as a single performance obligation if each good or service in the series represents a performance obligation that would be satisfied over time if each was accounted for separately, and the entity would use the same measure of progress toward the satisfaction of the performance obligation for each of those goods or services. So I think it would be better if we have illustrate these concepts. So tingnan muna natin tong illustration 1, yung determining whether the goods or services are distinct. Okay? So entity A is a contractor, enters into a contract to build a resort hotel for a customer. Entity A is responsible for the overall development and identifies various goods and services to be provided, including design, engineering, site preparation, procurement, construction, piping and wiring, installation of uninterruptible power supply system, swimming pools and jacuzzi, and finishing. The entity and its competitors regularly sells many of these goods and services separately to customers. So, anong sinasabi dito? Si Entity A, may contract siya to build a resort. Okay? So, included doon yung mga activities such as design, engineering, site prep, procurement, among others. So, what is our analysis? Is this a distinct transaction? Are we going to account for that activity as separate? So, tingnan natin yung analysis. The promised goods and services are capable of being distinct under criteria A. Sabi kasi, the customer can benefit, di ba? Bago mo sabihin distinct, tingnan mo yung dalawang criteria. Are the customers will be benefited, and is this separately identifiable? So, dito muna tayo sa A. Ang sabi dito, it is the customer can benefit daw from the goods and services either on their own or together with other readily available resources. This is evidenced by the fact that the goods and services are regularly sold to customers. In addition, the customer could generate economic benefit from the individual goods and services by using, consuming, selling, or holding them. So, criteria A, check. The customer can benefit from the transaction. Kasi kapag in-improve natin yung itong resort hotel na ito ay the benefit will be greater than the cost. However, di ba, ang another criteria is yung separately identifiable. Sabi dito, the goods and services are not distinct under criteria B. Bakit? Kasi ano ba yung nasa criteria B? Tingnan mo yung 1, 2, and 3. Alin dyan yung parang hindi siya nag-fall? Yung item 1. Sabi kasi doon, it is not an input to a combined output. Eh, ano ba yung sinasabi? Because they are not separated from each other. This is evidenced by the fact that the entity provides a significant service of integrating the goods and services. Imagine mo yung input, di ba? Yung sinabing mga activities, jacuzzi, the pipe wiring, blah, blah, blah. These are needed to construct a hotel resort. The hotel resort is the combined output. So, the inputs, yung mga activities na in-enumerate, ay kailangan for the combined output for which the customer has contracted. Eh, di ba ang sinasabi, it is separately identifiable if it is not an input. input nga yung activities na yun sa combined output. So therefore, under criteria B, it is not distinct. Okay. Paano yun, sir? Criteria A, okay. Criteria B, hindi. Ano bang sabi? Dapat and. Dapat laging sabay yun. Dapat a customer can benefit and it is separately identifiable. Therefore, because both criteria are not met, hindi na met yung parehas na criteria na yun, the goods and services are not distinct. The entity accounts for all the goods and services in the contract not separately but as a single performance obligation. So, yung kabuuan noong construction ng hotel resort ang i-account natin. Okay? Let's move to the satisfaction of performance obligations. Satisfaction of performance obligations. Kasi laging binabanggit yung performance obligation on the steps. Ano ba itong performance obligation? The performance obligation under your business law or in obligation and contracts specifically, yung obligation natin to perform a specific activity or task. So under the construction contracts, it can be satisfied either over time or at a point in time. Bakit over time? Kasi nga 2 or more accounting periods ang affected. So i-account mo siya. Kailan mo i-account yung revenue and cost ay kung yung construction project ay 5 years. So ano ang paano natin i-accrue or di-defer itong mga costs and revenues related to the construction. So meron po tayong criteria. So a performance obligation is satisfied over time if one of the following is met. So isa lang, kahit isa lang is okay na. The customer simultaneously receives and consumes the benefits provided by the entity's performance as the entity performs. B. The entity's performance creates or enhances an asset that the customer controls as the asset is created or enhanced. And the entity's performance does not create an asset with an alternative use to the entity, and the entity has an enforceable right to payment for performance completed to date. So isa-isahin lang natin. A. The customer simultaneously receives and consumes the benefits provided by the entity's performance as the entity performs. So, ang sinasabi lang dito, habang nagtatrabaho yung construction company, ay nare-receive niya yung benefit related to that. Yung kung ano man yung work in progress niya, may nare-receive siyang benefit related to that. Kaya tingnan mo yung example. If the contract with the customer is discontinued, halimbawa, si customer decided not to continue the contract, diniscontinue na or terminate niya. Yung customer, if the customer enters into a contract with another, halimbawa, ibang construction company, to fulfill the remaining performance obligation, the other entity would not need to substantially reperform. So, hindi niya kailangang ulitin yung ginawa ng unang entity kasi nabayaran naman na din yun at na-perform, yung work in progress related to that ay yung benefit doon ay na-consume. Okay? Ganun ang sinasabi under item A. So, ibig sabihin, kapag ganito yung transaction, the performance obligation is satisfied over time. Diba? As the entity works, the entity is provided the revenues related to that. B. The entity's performance creates or enhances an asset. Halimbawa, yung entity, yung ginagawa niyang construction project, it enhances. Kung halimbawa ito ay restoration of an asset or related mga ganong klaseng activity, it enhances the asset. It is classified as a performance obligation satisfied over time. Item C, the entity does not create an asset with an alternative use to the entity and the entity has an enforceable right. Ano ibig sabihin nitong alternative use at saka enforceable right to payment? So, i-analyze natin kasi itong C medyo kailangan pa natin i-dig deeper siya. An asset that does not have an alternative use to the entity if the entity is restricted contractually from directing the asset for another use during or after the asset's completion. Ibig sabihin, ang sinasabi lang dito, wala siyang alternative use. Kung halimbawang matapos itong project na ito o yung pinapagawa sa kanya, halimbawang ihinto ito, hindi ito pwedeng maibenta or hindi ito pwedeng magamit. Wala siyang alternative use. Or in the absence of a contractual restriction. Kasi ang sabi dito, an asset does not have an alternative use to the entity if the entity is restricted contractually from directing the asset for another use. So, hindi mo siya nga magamit during or after the asset's completion. Or, in the absence of a contractual restriction, kung walang restriction sa paggamit nun, the entity would incur significant cost of rework before it can direct the asset for another use, or the entity would only sell the asset at significant loss. So, dalawa ang condition bago mo sabihin na siya ay walang alternative use. One is merong restriction doon sa contract, may restriction na hindi mo siya pwedeng gamitin during or after the assets completion. At kung wala namang ganun, hindi mo pa rin siya magamit because kailangan mo pa ng significant rework cost. Kailangan mo pa siyang i-modify para magamit mo siya uli. Or, worse, mabibenta mo lang siya at a loss. At a significant loss. So, mas maintindihan natin later on ito when we illustrate, okay? Basta binibigay ko lang muna sa iyo, binabato ko sa iyo yung concept. Baka mapulot mo pa siya by this time. The enforceable right to payment. So, meron another condition ang sinasabi dito. An entity has an enforceable right to payment for performance completed to date if the entity is entitled to compensation for the completed performance if the contract is terminated for reasons other than the entity's failure to perform as promised. So, ang sinasabi lang dito, kung halimbawa si company ay yung nagpagawa decided to terminate other than the reasons ng failure noong contracting company, yung compensation is sufficient. Yung naibayad na compensation is sufficient to cover the cost incurred in satisfying the performance obligation plus a reasonable profit margin. Okay? Kaya nga, ang sinasabi dito, the enforceable right to payment for performance completed to date. So, kung meron kang right doon sa mga na-perform mo na, yung mga work in progress mo, meron kang enforceable right for the payment of that. Okay. Remember, this is an end. The entity's performance, okay, the performance obligation ay i-classify, i-recap ko lang ha, the performance obligation will be classified as overtime, satisfied siya overtime kung the entity does not create an asset with an alternative use and the entity has a right to the payment of the performance na na-complete to date. Okay? Okay. Okay, meron tayong provision na nakalagay dito na likely the performance obligation is satisfied over time for most construction contracts kasi nga mahaba yung periods related to that. However, kailangan maintindihan natin ito. Although most of the cases are transactions over time, kailangan maintindihan natin yung reason kung bakit most of the time ay dito sila nagpo-fall, yung overtime. Satisfied overtime, yung over 2 or more accounting periods, yung recognition of revenue and costs. If the entity cannot demonstrate that the performance obligation is satisfied over time, it is presumed that the performance obligation is satisfied at a point in time. Yung sinasabing satisfied over time, ibig sabihin lang nun yung buong construction period. Doon siya nasa-satisfy yung performance obligation. Kasi kapag point in time, yung kung kailan lang siya na-accomplish, yun na siya. Tapos na yung project. Ganun. Let us illustrate the concept of alternative use. So entity A enters into a contract with the customer to build a customized solar panel. Entity A customizes solar panels for various customers. Each solar panel can differ substantially on the basis of each customer's needs. If the customer cancels the contract for reasons other than the entity's failure to perform, Entity A shall keep the solar panel. However, due to its specialized nature, significant modifications is needed before the solar panel can be sold to another customer. Okay. So, gagawa daw ng solar panel si Entity A. Okay, this is a construction contract also. Okay, ang sinasabi dito, if the customer cancel, kung kinancel daw ni customer yung contract for reasons other than dun sa failure ni Entity A. So, ibang reason ang sinasabi. Entity A shall keep the solar panel. However, due to its specialized nature, significant modification is needed. So, diba? This is a concept of alternative use. I-exemplify natin yung alternative use. Diba ang sabi kanina, under the concept of alternative use, dapat An asset does not have an alternative use to the entity if the entity is restricted contractually. At kung hindi siya restricted contractually, pwedeng it would incur significant rework costs bago niya yon magamit. Okay? Bago niya yon magamit. So, tingnan natin yung analysis niya dito. At contract inception, entity A assesses whether its performance obligation to build is a performance obligation that is satisfied over time using criteria A to C. Okay? As part of that assessment, entity A considers whether the solar panel has an alternative use to entity A, which is yung criteria C. Although entity A is not contractually restricted kasi wala namang naka-indicate dyan na hindi niya pwedeng i-direct yun sa another customer. The customer-specific design of the solar limit entity A's practical ability to readily direct it to another customer without incurring significant cost of rework. Consequently, the solar panel has no alternative use to entity A. Wala siyang alternative use to entity A because kailangan niya pa ng significant rework cost bago niya ito mai-redirect sa another or mai-benta sa another customer. However, okay, so wala siyang alternative use. Okay, so kung wala siyang alternative use, ano na ba siya? Automatic, it is a performance obligation satisfied over time? The answer is no. Kailangan mo munang i-identify kasi end ito. Dapat walang alternative use, and second, dapat meron siyang enforceable right to payment for performance completed to date. Okay? Kaya nga sabi dito, before entity A can conclude that its performance is satisfied over time, entity A should also assess if it has an enforceable right to payment for performance. So, ito yung continuation noong example na yon. So, ang sabi, the customer is required to make a 15% advance payment at contract inception. Subsequent payments are based on entity A's progress on the contract after proportionate deductions of the advance payment and 10% retention. The 10% retention is due when the solar panel is completed and has passed the prescribed performance test. The payments are non-refundable unless entity A fails to perform as promised. If the customer cancels the contract, entity A retains any payments received but has no right to further compensation. So what is our analysis? So entity A considers whether it has an enforceable right. So kung titingnan mo, yan, entity A has an enforceable right to payment for performance completed today because the payments are non-refundable. Una, non-refundable yung advance payment and based on entity's progress on the contract. The cumulative amount of the payments is expected at all times throughout the contract to sufficiently cover entity A's cost plus a reasonable profit margin. So dahil may provision related to subsequent payments based on the progress in the contract, it is we analyze this as a transaction that the entity has an enforceable right to the payment para doon sa mga work na na-complete niya to date. So, okay siya sa alternative use, okay rin siya sa enforceable right to payment. So, therefore, siya ay a performance obligation satisfied over time. Okay? Let us make a tweak related to the enforceable right to payment. Ito yung variation dun sa example na ito. Papaano, pansinin mo, this is the same. This is essentially the same. However, pinalitan yung subsequent payments based on entity A's progress on the contract by stating na the periodic payments equal to 40% throughout the estimated construction period and remaining 45% when the solar panel is completed. Okay? So, anong mangyayari kapag ganyan ang transaction at hindi ganito? Okay, our analysis is, kapag ganito yung transaction, the entity A will not have an enforceable right to payment for performance completed to date because even though non-refundable yung advance payments, the cumulative amount of those payments is not expected. Hindi natin ma-expect at all times throughout the contract to compensate entity A's performance na na-complete to date. For halimbawa, tingnan natin tong example. If the customer cancels the contract upon 100% completion, entity A would only be entitled to 55% payment. Ano yun? Yung advance na 15 at saka yung periodic payments. And that would be insufficient kasi kung 55% payment lang, that would be insufficient to cover the cost plus the reasonable profit margin. So, bakit kailangan ba yung cost at saka reasonable profit margin? Remember, sinasabi yun dito, mismo sa enforceable right to payment. Ang sabi niya dyan ay end. Diba? Ang sabi niya. Ang sabi dito, this is also a twist. Baka nakakalimutan mo. Mako-classify mo siya as an enforceable right to payment if they're entitled to compensation for the completed performance. Yung mga nagawa mo, mababayaran ka doon. And sabi dito, the compensation is sufficient to cover the cost incurred in satisfying the performance. Dapat yung compensation sufficient yun dun sa nagastos mo bilang contractor. One, meron kang right doon sa pag-enforce ng payment. And second, meron kang the compensation na makukolect mo is sufficient para dun sa cost na na-incur mo. And in this case, it will not be sufficient. Kasi paano kung terminate niya at 55% pa lang yung pwede mong makolekta dyan. So therefore, based on that, we cannot say, wait, balikan natin, parang lumagpas yata tayo. Okay, so andito tayo. Hence, according to that, based on this illustration, the performance obligation to build the solar is a performance obligation satisfied at a point in time, hindi siya over time. Kasi nga hindi na meet yung dapat yung compensation is sufficient to cover the cost and a reasonable profit margin. Let's twist more. Example, yung 1.2 and 1.3. Papaano kapag the balance is payable when the solar panel is completed? So, merong advance payment na 15, tapos yung the rest ng balance ay may bibigay lang sa'yo kapag nakompleto mo na yung solar panel. Paano yan? Paano mo i-account yan? The automatic, the entity A does not have the enforceable right to payment for performance completed to date. Kasi dun pa lang sa unang criteria, hindi na siya papasok. Kasi, paano kung i-terminate yan at 50% completion, na wala kang makukolect ng balance related to that? Dun sa mga nagawa mo ng at 50%. Kaya nga, yan is not so, anong classification mo dyan? It is an obligation that's satisfied at a point in time. Okay? Okay, let's proceed with step 3. In step 3, yung transaction price. So, transaction price is defined as the consideration to which an entity expects to be entitled in exchange for transferring promised goods or service to a customer, excluding amounts collected on behalf of third parties. Example, yung sales taxes. So, ang transaction price, dalawang component. One is the contract price, and second, any subsequent variations in the contract price to the extent that is probable that they will result in revenue and that are capable of being measured reliably. So, meron ganung catch-in. Pwedeng contract price or pwedeng may addition doon. Kasi hindi pwede namang iset lang by a contract price. Okay. However, the transaction price may not be equal to the contract price if the consideration is affected by variable consideration, constraining estimates, the existence of significant financing component, non-cash consideration, or consideration payable to a customer. So later on, I think there are discussions related to this para mas maintindihan natin. Pero more or less, ang sinasabi lang dito ay in most cases, yung transaction price is not equal to the contract price because of several considerations doon sa pag-construct. Hindi natin kasi ma-estimate at a contract price lang kung magkano magagastos natin dyan. Kaya nga, a construction contract may be, meron tayong tinatawag na cost plus contract and a fixed price contract. Yung fixed price contract, madaling maintindihan because nag-agree lang sila at a fixed contract price or a fixed rate. Pero sa cost plus, meron yung tinatawag na cost plus variable fee contract or cost plus fixed fee contract. Yung may identify na reimbursable cost plus a percentage of those costs. Okay? Ang sinasabi lang dyan ay yung mga lahat ng magagastos related to the construction ay i-reimburse, yung mga materials related to that, plus may percentage. Yung percentage na yun, normally yung bayad mo doon sa labor ng contractor. Or, pwede rin na hindi siya percentage but a fixed amount. Halimbawa, 1 million. Yung lahat ng cost na may incur plus 1 million. Kumbaga, yung 1 million will serve as a, kumbaga, labor for the construction. Parang ganun. So, tingnan natin yung example. You contracted Mr. Architect Engineer Contractor to build a house for you. So, ito yung case 1. The contract sales states at a price of 6 million for the house. So, ito na yung price for the house. So, anong classification na to? This is a fixed price contract because naka-identify na kaagad kung magkano yung babayaran mo, 6 million. The case 2, the contract states that you shall reimburse Mr. Contractor the total construction cost na 15%. So, anong tawag dito? I-reimburse mo kung magkano lahat ng materyales na nagamit dyan, plus may 15% si Mr. Contractor based on the cost. Okay? Anong tawag dyan? This is a cost plus a variable fee contract. Diba? May reimbursable cost, tas may 15% based on that reimbursable cost. Okay. Kapag naman hindi siya percentage, this is a cost plus fixed fee contract. Pansinin mo, reimburse ka dyan, pero ang construction cost mo plus 2 million. Okay. So, bakit may mga ganitong cases? Ito lang yung reason. Because it is not possible to accurately estimate the scope of the project, and there have been no precedent similar projects that can be used as a basis for this price quotation. Kaya meron tayong mga ganitong scenario ng cost plus variable and cost plus fixed fee contract. So, ang merong in the government, this cost plus variable fee. Ano tong variable fee? Yung may percentage. Ito yung most common na ginagamit in the government contracts. Yung pagpapagawa natin ng mga bridges, buildings, towers, and among others. So, meron tayong noted disadvantages for this. Disadvantages on the part of the contractor. Bakit? The contractor's recovery of overhead costs depends on the cost of materials. Yung cost of materials, it changes over time. Kasi kung magkano na ang biniding sa'yo based on the materials, yun na ang magiging basis mo ng iyong labor. Yung variable, yung percentage noon. Paano kung sobrang bumaba yung presyo ng materials o kaya biglang sobrang tumaas? It is not reliable yung magiging percentage mo dyan kasi hindi mo naman yan pwedeng baguhin while nagko-construct kasi on the government kung magkano na ang na-grant sa'yo on the contract, yun na ang paninindigan mo until the end of the construction contract. Unless pwede namang in very rare cases pwede namang mag-letter yung construction company for an adjustment, but it happens very rare in the government. So it is a disadvantage for the contractor because there can be a risk that the agreed percentage may prove to be too low. Pwedeng kasing sobrang baba niya because of the changes in the environment. So pwedeng malugi yung contractor diyan. Kaya nga, we encounter cases na yung mga contractor ay nagte-terminate sila ng mga construction contract. Kaya maraming mga government projects ang nahihinto because some are because of these reasons. Masyadong mababa yung percentage, so nalulugi sila. So instead na ituloy nila yung project, they have decided to terminate the contract at ipagpatuloy na lang ng ibang contractor. It is also a disadvantage to the contractee or the government because hindi ito nagpo-promote ng cost efficiency kasi ang tendency nito ay kung based sa reimbursable cost, tataasan lahat ng cost dyan para tumaas din ang labor component. So, hopefully the government procurement and policy board has identified measures that will hinder yung mga ganitong klaseng dilemma related to the cost plus variable fee, which is most common in the government. Okay? Step 4, Step 5, we allocate the transaction price. So kung ano, magkano na-identify mo transaction price, it will be allocated to your performance obligations. Step 5, we look at the recognition of revenue when or as a performance obligation is satisfied. So kung magkano lang yung revenue na ma-identify natin, and then we recognize it either as over time or at a point in time. Kasi sabi dito, if the performance obligation is contracted satisfied over time, the revenue is recognized over time as the entity progresses. If it is at a point in time, the entity recognizes a revenue when the performance obligation is satisfied. Okay? The performance obligation has been mentioned several times. So, uh, this performance obligation is measured if it is satisfied over time. There are appropriate methods on measuring yung mga two or more accounting periods na construction contract. One is output method and second is the input method. So medyo mahaba yung discussion related to input method and output method in the succeeding discussion videos. So I think we will be ending at presenting to you yung methods, yung output and the input methods as a measure in performance obligation satisfied over time. Please continue on the next succeeding videos for the discussion of the input and the output methods in accounting for these performance obligation over time, yung satisfied over time. Thank you.